Good evening, everybody, and welcome to JWA's Post-Quarantine Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am very happy to be back with you tonight for the second of our fall series. Please say hello in the chat. Make sure to chat to everyone so that we can all see who's here. We love to know who's with us in the room. And also, please, throughout the session, add your questions to the chat and we'll bring them into the conversation. We are so glad that we can continue offering this program and growing this community. It's been such a meaningful space, I know for me and for many others during the past 18 plus months, 20 months. I want to also thank Judaism Unbound for their partnership in this. Before I introduce our featured author for this evening and we begin our conversation, I want to say just a few words about JWA for those who may be new to us. We are a digital archive that expands the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We take an intersectional approach to Jewish history and culture because we believe that uncovering a more diverse story helps us understand the world we live in and create a better future. The quarantine book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. I hope you will go to jwa.org to check out the full range of projects and resources that we offer. We are celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, and I also hope that you'll consider joining us in just a few weeks on Thursday, November 4th for our virtual anniversary event, and we'll put some info in the chat about that so that you can check it out and register. It is a real pleasure to welcome a longtime friend of JWA to our program tonight. Judy Bolton-Fasman is the author of Asylum, a Memoir of Family Secrets from Mandel-Villar Press. Her essays and reviews have appeared in many major newspapers, including the New York Times and Boston Globe, essay anthologies, literary magazines such as McSweeney's, Brevity, Catapult, and Cognoscenti. She's also the recipient of numerous writing fellowships and a 4-time winner of the Rockhour Award from the American Jewish Press Association and a Pushcart Prize nominee. Judy recently received an honorable mention in Tiferet's Creative Nonfiction Essay Writing Contest. She is the arts and culture writer for JewishBoston.com. And I have to say personally, Judy and I first met in a course that I taught more than 15 years ago on Jewish women's memoirs. And it is just so amazing and moving to have her here tonight as the author of her own memoir. So welcome, Judy. Really, really excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Judith. I'm a big fan of JWA, and any chance I get to report on it is always such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And we sort of switched roles tonight. You're asking the questions, and I'm going to answer them. Hopefully, I'll answer them well. I thought that we would start out by reading just a little bit from the book. Would that
That's
work
perfect.
for you? Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to give you a little context for this, and I'm going to switch glasses because that's what happens. And it's a chapter called Driving. Driving is a motif in the book because my mother was a non-driver, and that led us to spend many hours traveling back and forth on the Asylum Avenue bus. I should mention that the title mainly refers to the street I grew up on in West Hartford, Connecticut, 1735 Asylum Avenue. And we were on if it wasn't on the bus line, if it wasn't on the Asylum Avenue bus line, we didn't go. So I'm just going to read a little bit about an adventure that we had on the bus with my mom. The Asylum Avenue bus lived up to its name and gave my mother asylum in other ways. It provided opportunities. When I was in elementary school, boarding the 320 bus with my mother for my allergy shots was like crossing into another country. This one was mostly populated by Portuguese house cleaners. After they finished cleaning for the ladies of West Hartford, they waited for the A1 at nearly every stop from Bishop's Corner to Steel Road. They unwittingly created a vibrant language laboratory for my mother. This is how you learn a language, directly from a native speaker. My mother was flushed with excitement, something I had never seen in her. Portuguese reminds me of Ladino, she said. In addition to Spanish, my mother spoke the 15th century Spanish tongue that was leavened with Hebrew and a stew of other Mediterranean languages. In those Portuguese ladies and their rapid-fire talk, she heard strains of her precious Ladino, which, like my mother, survived in surprising ways in unlikely places. Listen to this, she said, thrilled at her discovery. Cadera means hip in Spanish, and just one extra I, as in cadera, and it means chair in Portuguese. It was because of Ladino that my mother's family landed in Cuba for a generation. In the early 1900s, my abuelos embarked on separate boat trips west from Greece and Turkey, respectively. So much the better that they docked in Cuba. Ladino was the precious baggage they lugged from country to country, century to century. It was the language of my ancient crowd. It was a kitchen language, excitedly and loudly spoken by my mother, aunt, and my grandmother. No one is angry, my Aunt Rena tried to convince me. That's how we talk. It was also a language that rubbed shoulders with the Portuguese of the house cleaners who rode the A1 bus. To befriend these women was natural for my mother. They had the same sort of austere Sephardic Jewish faces, Jews who had been wandering the world since the Inquisition. The J sound in Ladino was the same vibrating and zippery sound in Portuguese. There was also a fair amount of Arabic in Ladino, as in the word mashallah, may God bless you. At the base of everything were interchangeable Hebrew and Spanish words. But nothing made my mother more furious when someone described Ladino as the Sephardic version of Yiddish. We are not Polacos, her pejorative term for Eastern European or Ashkenazic Jews. When she was angry with my father, gringo and polaco flew from her mouth. At night, my mother became a class of one, drilling herself with a book called 501 Portuguese Verbs. So much Ladino, so much like Ladino, she said with admiration. She was joyous in making the linguistic leap. On the bus, the Portuguese ladies flashed gold-toothed smiles at her impressive progress. Her accent was good, too. To me, Portuguese was disorienting in that it was almost familiar, but not quite. It was Spanish spoken in a minor key. The syllables were wide enough for me to fall through and miss entire phrases. The UEs of Spanish, as in bueno, flattened down to O's in Portuguese, as in bom. The Portuguese A's were as long and chilly as our basement in winter. My mother was a language machine. The more fluent she became, the more involved she was with her new friends. Soon after meeting them, she turned entrepreneurial and became their booking agent. First, she placed them with the people she knew in the neighborhood. Like a game of telephone, word had gotten around to call my mother to find a reliable house cleaner. My mother co opted unused blue books from the night courses my father taught at the University of Hartford and used them to keep track of the women's jobs. Even my father helped. These women are hard workers, he said. You have to admire that.
Thank you so much, Judy, for sharing that. And part of what I love about the piece that you chose is that it's one of the scenes in the book where you see your mother's kind of strength and ingenuity, and where you're able to take that in. One of the places where you start to witness that for yourself. And I think part of what makes your book so alive is that your mother was so complicated, and so much of your book is, it's about the mysteries of your parents and their relationship, but also trying to kind of parse out the kind of complicated nature of your mother and who she was, and how to manage the kind of different pieces that she had. And so I think that strand of seeing that her determination and her skill at language and the way that she was able to flip that becomes something that you see, like you uncover that through the book, kind of the ways that she was creative even in her kind of very messy way of living her life.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you mentioned that, and that I read that scene, because the book initially started out in a very, very early iteration of a kind of almost keeping like a journal of the year I said the cottage for my father. And it's I think of this book as my dad's book in some ways, and we're not going to reveal the central mystery of why I think that it's my dad's book, but at every turn my mother as a character pops up and almost threatens to run away with the narrative. So I sort of have to tamp her down a little bit in the narrative. But yes, her strength and determination were inspiring, sometimes embarrassing when I was a kid. But my next project is working on her. The next project belongs to her, and there is an essay that I recently wrote where I described my mother as damaged and determined, and that she was really a mix of both those things. So, yeah.
I love that image of your mother kind of popping up to take over the narrative, because that seems like something that she would do. That she would
Absolutely.
insist that she had a
Absolutely.
place in the narrative and that she was not going to be left out or sidelined or made a minor character.
Yeah, she very much has a place in the narrative. My parents' relationship is front and center in this book, as you know, and she very much drove that relationship, especially later in my father's life. So she has to be there. She has to be there. We just have to sort of have to keep her in her place, and sometimes that's not always so easy to do, because she's really kind of fun to write about in some ways. And at other points it was very emotional for me to write this book.
So tell us a little bit about your parents and sort of what brought you to this project.
Well, what brought me to the project, as I said before, is I wanted to save the cottage for my father. And I started out thinking that I was only going to say it for 30 days. It just seemed really overwhelming to say it for 11 months. I had young kids at the time, and I just didn't know how I was going to make my way to a minion every night. Well, 1 month turned into 2 months, and my father died Erev Rosh Hashanah. And by the time it was Thanksgiving, I realized I'd been going every day, and I had sort of mastered the chewy Aramaic of the Kaddish. I was very intimidated by saying the words because I had not read Hebrew in a long time, or Hebrew letters, and I was very rusty. And I realized by Thanksgiving the time just flew by, and I realized I was there every day, and that I was having posthumous conversations with him in a way. I mean, those were my prayers. I wasn't always saying the set prayer, but I was always thinking of him, and he was always in my head. And that was really lovely because towards the end of his life, he was very ill and he didn't even speak. And I missed that, and I missed having conversations with him. And the Kaddish was a vehicle for me to do that. And then the book took a turn because I realized the that my book or whatever I was creating was more of a diary, more of a journal, and I didn't see who would be interested in it outside of my family. So I was in Israel, and I was having a conversation with my friend Susan, who you know, and she said, you really have to go back and find people who knew your dad back in the day. She said it'll probably be hard because a lot of people aren't alive, but you really have to make that effort. So I did. I found a couple of friends that were still alive. I even found the woman who introduced my parents in Brooklyn, and I talked to them and I found out stuff. And then I took it one step further under the advice of a friend who was an investigative reporter. He said, "Go to the library. Your father graduated from Yale. Go to the library. They have, notes, class notes going back, 100 years or more, and read his class notes." He said, "You will be amazed at what you will find out from class notes, because my father was one of those guys who wrote into class notes." So I did, and I learned a lot. Especially, he was an officer during the Second World War, and he wrote constantly from wherever he was. He wrote about Yale football, which he was, such an avid fan of. He wrote about where he was stationed. It was just a cornucopia of information, and I was thrilled to have it because he didn't talk very much about himself. He didn't really make himself a character in his stories.
There's a place in the book where you talk about, the whole book in some ways is about seeking out secrets or trying to unpack these secrets. And you
Mhm.
talk about how your father's secrets were secrets of omission, and your father's stories were kind of secrets of omission, and your mother's stories were these kind of fairy tales, and they each had their ways of, where there were ways in which you were seeking the truth from each of them, but it was very different because there was a kind of absence for your father, and with your mother there was a lot there, but it wasn't clear what was true.
Right. Right. Well, there was a big age gap between my parents, almost 17 years. So a lot of things sort of bloomed in that age gap. A lot of stories and missed stories, and but I think of my parents as people very much rooted in the 20th century. My mother's from Cuba, and she brings that whole background with her of the Batista years, and then the Castro regime, and Cuba loomed very large in my childhood. we couldn't go there. The country was on lockdown. We really had no access to it whatsoever. I mean, we had pictures, but I remember once my aunt made a call to some relatives who were still there, and it was a really big deal to call Cuba. It was a big deal to call long distance then anyway, but to call Cuba, it was like you really had to do a lot of, finagling to get that call through. I also think of my dad as a guy of the 20th century. He was born in 1919, early on in the century. Woodrow Wilson was still the president. Um, and I think of him, he served in the Second World War. He lived through the Great Depression. And I think of him very much as being a man of the 20th century. And he was a very patriotic guy. You can argue what that patriotism was, whether it was kind of rooted in, innocence and naivete or whatever, but he was very, very patriotic, and he really loved this country and what this country gave him and his family.
Yeah, I mean, and I was impressed with the kind of digging that you were able to do of trying to uncover the man behind, behind his self-presentation, getting his naval records and, trying to
Hmm.
understand what his experiences might have been that he didn't want to talk about or didn't share.
His naval records were really a surprise to me because he was not always the most obedient naval officer. And there is a particular instance in his naval records where it mentions that he was remanded to quarters for 24 hours, I think. And I thought, what is that all about? What did he do that he was remanded to quarters? And my brother, who was sort of, he talked to my brother a little bit more than he talked to his daughters. And my brother said that he remembered telling him a story that he was remanded to quarters because he was technically out of uniform. He took off his hat to comfort the cook on the ship, who happened to be black, whose brother died in the European theater. And he put his arm around him and he called him by his formal name, not by they called the cook Cookie, but he put his arm around him, he called him Ernie, and he hugged him. And for that, he was remanded to quarters, at least according to my brother. And I was always very impressed with that story because it seemed to me very much in character with the dad I knew.
Hmm. And it's such a sign also of how the documents don't always tell us the full story, right? From the
Right.
papers, all it said is that he had, broken the rule and taken off his uniform or whatever, and you don't hear the human piece behind it. On the other hand, when you hear the human stories, sometimes you don't know how much those have been kind of embellished or how they've been remembered differently, and that's always the challenge, and for you as someone who is exploring this through memoir, there's sort of always that question of like how do you navigate truth, how do you present it, whose truth is, are there many truths, what does that look like, and how did you think about that question of sort of like what your responsibility was to the truth, or figuring out whose truth was the one that you wanted to present in that way?
Constantly, constantly. I'm very forthright in the book that this is a work of speculative nonfiction. I speculate a lot. But in my speculation, I also mix it with the facts, the solid facts that I had, like the naval record. And in my heart, I firmly believe that this creative nonfiction speculation with the facts I had on hand yielded a very bold and deep truth. Um, so that gives me a lot of comfort going forward in that I think I've unearthed various truths, and I'm very comfortable with that. I didn't solve everything, as you know, but I think I yielded some deep truths that were very important for me to find out.
Right. And the truth is that everyone is searching for their own truth. Even your siblings might have different questions that they
Mhm.
would bring to this that were not the questions that you necessarily had.
Right, right. They were pretty they were pretty on board with how I figured things out. So that was
Right.
nice. We were sort of all, united on that front.
Um, I want to go back. You said that this book started with writing about Kaddish, but you also talk in the book about your master's thesis and how it included a story about about your father, and that sort of made you realize, like, gosh, I've been part of this project of trying to understand my dad for so many years, because even back then I was exploring what I knew about him and what I understood about him. And um how did you, you know what was it like to realize that had been an ongoing theme, and how did you kind of change from writing about it in stories to deciding it would be a memoir?
Right. I got my MFA, my Master in Fine Arts, in fiction writing, and my thesis was really the first stirrings of Asylum, looking back on it. I mean, I pulled it out during the course of writing this memoir, and I realized, oh my goodness, I really have been thinking about this forever and trying to write about it. Um, and the title of my thesis is The 90-Day Wonder. And my father was a 90-day wonder. In the course of doing research, I found out that the 90-day wonder is a bit of a pejorative term in terms of um, young men who graduated college were fast tracked to be officers, and often they were commanding men that were sort of, sailors, people who were in the Army for life, people who had been in the Army, in the Navy for life. And, these 21, 22, 23-year olds were all of a sudden, they had to be saluted to. So, the term is a little pejorative. But I called the thesis the 90-Day Wonder because I loved the word wonder in it, because I had been wondering for so long, and I wondered so much about my father. He really was a mysterious figure to me. And I actually come out and talk about what his travels were before I was born. And he was in naval intelligence, and I don't want to give too much away, but he sort of continued that line of work after he got out of the Navy. So it was always on my mind, and I definitely saw the stirrings of Asylum very clearly when I pulled out that thesis.
We have a question about your dad's experience at Yale and whether he ever talked about anti-Semitism there. He graduated in 1940, right? So
Yes,
he
he
was there
did.
in the 30s. What did he talk about? What it was like to be a Jew at Yale at that time?
Yes and no. My grandfather also graduated with the class of 1913. And my grandfather was an immigrant. And my father's family was decidedly not Jewishly identified. I mean, they wouldn't deny that they were Jews, but they really they didn't practice. My father grew up very reformed, which was in the early 1900s, the early part of the 20th century. He didn't know a word of Hebrew, and their name was Bolton. They changed it, so they really wanted to pass. My grandfather tells the story of he was a member of the musicians union. That's how he paid to go to Yale. He was a very good violinist. He later had an orchestra. But anyway, that's how he got through Yale. He played, the proms up and down the eastern seaboard with his violin. And one day he asked the dean permission if he could take an exam in the afternoon rather than the morning, because he had been up all night, playing at this prom. And the dean told him, no, poor immigrant boys should not go to Yale if they can't take their exams on time.
Hmm.
So that was the only thing he ever really said. No, my father was very assimilated, very, and he was a second generation Yaley too. And I think that sort of gave him a different sort of standing. So he never talked about anti-Semitism, but I'm sure he experienced it, but he wouldn't say. He
Right. I
wouldn't say.
mean, there definitely were quotas at Yale still then,
Mhm.
and not a lot of Jews. And I'm actually a Yaley, and it was very different when I was there. But there's a great book about Jews at Yale called "Joining the Club" that talks a lot about sort of
Yes.
what that
Yes.
what that experience
Yes.
was like.
Yes.
Um, in terms of your grandfather, you also write about how you found the memoirs that your grandfather wrote and how interesting it was. You were so excited to, learn something, and that then he wrote, he there was so much that he didn't write about, like being Jewish, and he wrote a ton about his work as an engineer, and that you felt like you learned more about the sewer system than about his
I
own
did.
life.
I did. Yes.
did you bring that awareness of sort of how to curate a story, or maybe how not to curate a life story into your own project once you had found that?
Yes, I knew that he was working on this memoir when I was a little girl forever. He would have this was in the 70s, so he hired a typist named Stephanie, and Stephanie would bring him sheets of paper, and he would, correct it, and it took him forever to do this memoir. And when I finally read it in graduate school, I thought, why am I learning more, as you said, about the sewer system in New Haven, Connecticut, than I am about my grandfather? There were some interesting things, like he practiced the violin after school, and he he brought money to the family with his violin playing and things like that. But he rarely talked about. I don't even think. In fact, I know that story he told me about the dean is not in his book. It's a
Mm,
very sanitized version of his life. Um, so it was curious, and a little disappointing too.
right. And I guess also is a sign of, there are so many different agendas that people bring to their writing. Yours was about discovery and self-discovery and trying to make meaning from, your parents' story and figure out what that meant to you. And for your grandfather, it was probably presenting, something more, um, a kind of more public facade of how he wanted his life to be remembered.
Right. And it was very chronological. So it was a very kind of old fashioned chronology and old fashioned structure. So it was very different than what I tried to do. But I'm still glad to have it. I'm still glad to have his words. So,
Yeah, no, that is a very special thing to be able to
mhm,
have, even if it's not so personal, but still gives you a context.
exactly.
Um, so you've talked a little bit about your parents, and one of the things that obviously was a big difference. They had a lot of cultural differences, both in terms of being American and being Cuban, and also your father's Ashkenazi, and your mother's Sephardi. And what was that like to sort of navigate those two different heritages and those two cultures?
It's interesting. When I was a little girl, I was kind of my mother's kid more than my father's, because my father was more of a mysterious figure. He was more um, aloof than my mother. And there were times when I felt like I was all Sephardic, because that was because my father's family didn't practice anything. All the holidays were done with my mother's family. And then when I got older, I felt more like my father's daughter. So navigating it wasn't that difficult, because there was no competing traditions. I mean, it was all Sephardic all the time. So
Mhm.
my father let my mother just sort of um, run what sort of traditions we would have, and what observances we would do. So I don't remember ever spending a Jewish holiday with the Bolton side of the family. Thanksgiving, yes. Winter holidays, yes, but not a Jewish holiday. We never did Rosh Hashanah. We never had a Seder with them. It just wasn't done on my father's side of the family. And as opposed to my mother's Cuban side, we had these raucous, great Seders. With my abuelo saying, el año que viene en Havana, instead of next year in Jerusalem, next year in Havana, because that was sort of it was almost messianic. They couldn't go back. I mean, it was really locked down, and that also you know, affected me, and made Havana and Cuba and that whole myth loom so large in my life.
Right. And what about how have you woven those Spartic traditions into your life, into your own family that you've created yourself?
It's funny, because when my son was born, I wanted to name him after my husband's grandfather, who was still alive. And it really caused his family some distress.
Hmm.
It caused him some distress. I was really surprised. I thought they would all be thrilled. And nope, they really, that was the first time I sort of like encountered sort of a little bit of a roadblock.
Hmm.
So I did not. I actually named Adam after my father, his Hebrew name, who was still alive. That was fine, but they did not want me naming him after Ken's grandfather, who was still alive at the time.
Hmm.
So those types of things, more like anecdotal things than anything. It was an Ashkenazi community that I grew up in, and then I went to yeshiva, and so it wasn't so Sephardic. We did things like we ate rice on Pesach, um, and people that I knew, thought, oh, really, you do that? You mean we would never do that? That kind of thing. My mother was also very aware of being a minority within a minority.
Hmm.
And I think that is when I realized my Sephardic heritage almost the most, when she was very, as I read, she would get incensed when people would say Ladino is like the Sephardic Yiddish. I mean, she was very proud of Ladino, and she was very proud of her Spanish heritage, to the point that she said she was descended from the Duke of Albuquerque. I don't know if that's true, but she made a pretty convincing case that she was of Spanish royalty. So, Sephardic was very glamorous for me when I was a kid. We had Spanish royalty. She was descended from the Duke of Albuquerque. We did things a little differently. I think it was more like tradition than actual observance that I noticed the difference between the Sephardic and Ashkenazi parts of my family.
Mm-hmm. And you ultimately do travel to Havana to kind of seek out some of your mother's roots and some of, uncover a little bit more about the stories that she had told, which had taken on this kind of mythic proportion because, of course, you know, she had been in exile and couldn't go back. So tell us a little bit about what that was like to try to trace her stories through Havana.
Being in Havana was I expected it to be very emotional for me. But when I went to visit her house, after I left, I sat on the front stoop for a while, and I bawled. I mean, I just cried. I didn't even know where the tears were coming from, because early on in the book, in fun, I take on a persona of Judy Bolton, girl detective. There actually was a mystery series in the 40s and the 50s, Judy Bolton. And I remember seeing it on my cousin's bookshelf, and I remember seeing it in my school library. And I was just thrilled to see my name on the spine of a book. Judy Bolton, my gosh, it was like in print. And so going to Cuba was extremely emotional, and it also revealed things to me that my mother had sort of embellished. She told me she lived in a beautiful large apartment with 2 floors, which was not the case in a posh neighborhood. It was not the case. It was a fairly small apartment, um, and that's where she lived with her family. She also told me that and I will reveal one secret in the book, that she was a graduate of the University of Havana. So when I was walking around the university, I started talking to a student there, and he asked me what I was doing there, and I said, "Oh, my mom went to the university." And he said, "Oh, what did she study?" And I said, "Oh, she studied social work." And he looked at me very curiously, and he said, "What years did she study social work?" I said, "Oh, I think she was here in 1956 and 1957. He said, "The university was closed then, and we never had a school of social work." So I started backtracking and putting things together, and I realized that my mother never went to college. But God bless her, she got 2 master's degrees in the United States, and she did it by telling when she was applying, and it was in the 60s, "I'm from Cuba. There is no way for me to get any transcripts. Everything is behind the Iron Curtain." And that's how she did it. She talked her way into a master's program in Spanish literature.
I guess that's one of the benefits of being an immigrant, but particularly an immigrant for whom the world that you come from is sort of locked away, is it gives you the freedom to reimagine it and rewrite it and tell a whole new story about where you came from. So maybe some of that creative impulse of reimagining and rewriting stories clearly got passed on to you, not in terms of this book, obviously you're not engaged in fiction, but clearly she probably had some frustrated writer genes in there, even if she wasn't aware of it.
I loved finding it out. I wasn't, I think she now admits that she didn't go to university. She admitted that a couple of years ago. And I think she thought I was going to be disappointed or angry. And I wasn't. I really admired her creativity and her wiliness. I thought it was great that she did, that she had, the chutzpah to do that. It was fantastic. And, looking back on it, she struggled her first year of getting her master's degree. She struggled with reading Don Quixote. Not that she wasn't a good reader or anything, but she struggled with the analysis and she was overwhelmed with all the term papers she had to write. She eventually got into the groove and did very well and graduated. But that first year, I remember, was very, very tough for her.
And as we sort of started with at the beginning, she's an interesting character in the book because she is very vulnerable and very unstable and also very strong, clearly.
Mm-hmm. And it really is interesting to me, too, that my father must have known that she didn't go to university, but he totally supported her going back to get her master's degree. She was among the throngs of women in the 60s that went back to school to reinvent themselves, to have a career, to become independent. And he was very supportive of that. And he never said anything to the contrary, that she didn't have a degree or she shouldn't be applying to, in fact, he was thrilled that when she graduated.
Yeah. Has your mom read the book?
Unfortunately, my mom isn't well now. She's she has a lot of dementia, and
Mm-hmm.
no, she hasn't. And when we did try to approach the story with her about my dad, she completely broke down, and we decided that, my siblings and I decided that we would not um upset her further with the story. So no, she hasn't read the book. She knows there is a book, but she hasn't
Mm-hmm.
read the book.
We have a question about the title, and I know you said at the beginning the title, mostly stems from your address, but can you talk a little bit about why you chose that
Hmm.
to be the title?
Yes. Well, Asylum Avenue in West Hartford, or in Hartford, I should say, is a main thoroughfare. If any of you have traveled from the Northeast to New York on Interstate 84, you will see the big sign, a big exit sign for Asylum Street. And people have always told me, whenever I see that sign, I think of you. Friends who have been traveling back and forth from Boston to New York, and it was originally named for a young girl whose father founded an asylum, and this is not very PC terms, for the deaf and dumb. She was deaf, and it was the Hartford Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb, and it was originally on Asylum Avenue, Asylum Street. So that's where the name comes from, Asylum Avenue, and I grew up 3 miles up the road at 1735 Asylum Avenue, 3 miles up the road from the original asylum. So it's my street name, which was it's almost like a gift. Like, how could I not use it for the title? I mean, it's fantastic. Although my mother was an immigrant to this country, she came in 1958. My relatives came in the early 60s and did seek asylum in this country. In fact, they were helped by HIAS, among other agencies, and they really did have refugee status when they came here. So they very much sought asylum here. And then there's the sort of old-fashioned connotation of asylum as a place where people who are challenged in various ways go, and we certainly were challenged, and we certainly had our dysfunctions, and there's also that meaning in there too. It's a little cheeky, but it does creep into the meaning. But mostly it's named for the street I grew up on and for the asylum that my relatives sought when they came here from Cuba.
It is true that if you have such a metaphorically rich address to play with, how could you not? And you're writing about your childhood, how could you not make use of it?
Right, right.
It's too good to pass up.
It definitely was.
I want to turn to the Kaddish, because you write a lot about Kaddish and you kind of weave it through the book. And I know you said that was sort of where you started this writing project, in terms of your, using it as a tool for kind of trying to understand your father, know your father, make peace with your father. But you also write about some of its impact on your Jewish identity and your kind of sense of ritual and practice. So I'd love to hear a little more about that too.
Well, the Kaddish gave me structure, and I came to embrace that structure. And it also, in some ways, I'm not, a hyper observant Jew, but in many ways, it returned me to Judaism. It returned me to observance. Um, at one point, my kids went to Solomon Schechter Day School. They went to a conservative day school, and I had a very opposite experience in going to a yeshiva, particularly as a girl. And I wanted my daughter to have a very egalitarian experience. And I was so thrilled that there was a Solomon Schechter Day School, a Jewish community day school, that would accommodate that, because I never wanted her to feel like she didn't have full rights as a Jew. So the Kaddish also, I remember when I got married like 30 years ago, I wasn't allowed on the bima to bless the Torah with my husband with my groom during his ufruf, because even though it was a conservative synagogue, women were only allowed to bless the Torah one Shabbat a month, and the day of the ufruf was not that Shabbat, and that shocked me. That really really shocked me, because at the time I had worked for JTS, and they were ordaining. I got married in 1991. They were ordaining women. I mean, I like didn't get it. Like, how could they not let me not bless the Torah? But that was the case. I learned a lot saying the Kaddish, and as I said, it gave me a structure, and it gave me a reason to engage in a meditative life, if not a prayerful life. But I also learned a lot about what women could and couldn't do in various synagogues, and that made an impression on me. And that also brought me back to my memories of the yeshiva days.
One of the stories that you reference, which just made me so happy, was the story of Henrietta Zold,
Hmm.
who in 1916 insisted on saying Kaddish for her mother, even though that was certainly not accepted practice at the time. And she wrote this beautiful letter, and you actually cite that letter from JWA, to her friend, her family friend, who offered to say Kaddish on her behalf. And she wrote this very gracious letter about why she appreciated that offer but needed to turn him down, and why she was going to say Kaddish for her mother herself, against kind of all tradition, and why she was sure that her mother would approve of that. And I teach that text all the time. And
I thought it was an amazing letter. I thought it was absolutely, because you said it was written in 1916, and there were no brothers in the family. She's the oldest of 8 girls, and she wanted to take on that role and that tradition and that mitzvah, quite frankly, of doing that. And I love that letter too. I just it's so special, and it's so inspiring.
And I think it's also, I think there are so many women who have had the experience that you had of saying Kaddish in lots of different places, and becoming aware of how different practices are in different places, and often coming up against a wall of not being able to participate, being in places where you're like outside of the room where Kaddish is happening because there's no mechitza and they won't let women in, or, all kinds of experiences that people have of trying to find a place and feeling excluded at this moment of great need and, time sensitive meaning. Um, and that's been a kind of feminist awakening for so many women. And then to realize that that's been the case, not just in, really modern, in sort of contemporary times, but for generations, that's been a situation that women have struggled with, I think puts that moment into some perspective, um, and gives you a kind of lineage for women trying to carve out the space to participate in Jewish ritual life in a different way.
It's funny. It reminds me of a story of the year I said Kaddish, we were on vacation in Rome my husband and I wanted to say Kaddish. I really didn't want to miss a day. I had like come so far. I think it was like the ninth or 10th month of mourning, and I really wanted to continue. So we sought out the Great Synagogue in Rome, and it was very secure. Had a lot of security guards. Had soldiers with rifles patrolling it, and so we went to the little guardhouse and said we wanted to come to services, and the guard asked, "Why do you want to come to services?" And I answered because I was the one that was saying the Kaddish, and I said, "Well, I'm saying the Kaddish for my father, and I want to say it tonight here." He said, he looked at me, he looked at my husband, he looked at me again, and he said, "Americana," you know, and he just, you thought these crazy American women, thinking that they could come and say the Kaddish. But, we did. We were certainly separated. I was in the women's section, and my husband was, in the men's section. We were separated actually by a row of potted plants. And when I stood up to say the Kaddish, a very lovely woman who I'd been chatting with, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You don't have to do that. We don't do that." And I said, "No, I have to do that." And, she was lovely about it, very gracious. And, at the end, that was really a mourner's minyan. Everybody who was there was mourning somebody. And at the end, their tradition was to go into a side room and light a tea light, a candle for their loved one. And they offered me one, and, I lit it for my father. That was just a very interesting mix of traditions. I had never, seen that. But yeah, but I just remember the guard he kept looking at me and looking at my husband and looking at me, and he just figured, it was some crazy American lady.
Right. Yes. Well, if I can share a personal story myself, when I was saying Kaddish for my mom, I also had little kids, and it was the first time that I really understood the tradition of women being exempt from time bound commandments, from participating in time bound commandments, because it was so difficult to figure out how to get to services, because it was either happening when my kids were getting up and they needed to get to school, or when they were having dinner and going to bed. I mean, it was just, the timing was always terrible. And I felt like I was always pulled in different directions and rushing around. And it was the first time I had this insight of like, I understand why in a time where women lived a traditional domestic life, would not have been possible to work this in. And it kind of gave me a different insight and patience with that a little bit, just a different experience of that particular traditional limitation.
I had the same experience too. In fact, a friend who was saying Kaddish at the same time that I was, remember my son, who is now 6 feet tall and 24 years old. He was 5 years old at the time, going in a bathrobe, and he wouldn't get dressed. He went in his bathrobe to the evening minyan and his Scooby Doo slippers. That's just the way it was. My husband was traveling; there was no one to leave him with, and he didn't want to change, and that's how we went.
Yep. Well, the Kaddish works its magic no matter what the context is.
I was actually happy to share it with the kids in a way, because my daughter Anna, would go with me on Tuesdays, Tuesday evenings, because her friend was also there with her mom, who was mourning her dad, and they were the Ashrei kids. They were the kids who said the Ashrei prayer on Tuesdays together. So that was also very bonding.
Yeah. I want to point out, because I think this is an important part of your story, that this is your first book that you're publishing. You've been a writer for a very long time and you've written a ton of things, but this is your first published book, a debut at age 60, which I think is just exciting and inspiring. And I'd love to hear your reflections on that experience, and maybe any advice that you have to writers about how to do this, how to write a book.
Well, as you said, I've been a writer for a long time. It kind of is my first published book, but it isn't my first book. I mean, there's a couple of tries in the drawer, and metaphorically, still the pages are still rustling. But yeah, it's my first published book, and I'm thrilled that I was able to finally do it. And I think that the key to that is that I finally did it. I didn't stop. I never, even when there were months or even years when I didn't work on it, I was always writing it in my head, or I was actually making notes. And one of the things that gave me a lot of structure was to join a writing community. And that's very easy to do now because everything's virtual and you can join several writing centers across the country. I happen to have gone in person pre-pandemic to Grub Street and got a lot out of it. But I want to say, particularly to the women who are with us tonight, you're making art all the time. You don't have to be sitting in front of your laptop 8 hours a day writing. You're making art when you scribble notes in the carpool line. You're making art when you make your grocery list and you scribble something that you want to, refer to later, or put into a sentence or put into a paragraph, or you may be sketching something. That's making art, and that's important, and it's very integral to the process, and you should honor that and honor yourselves for doing it. And there's no expiration on making art. And, as corny as it sounds, there's no expiration on dreams. Dream, dream big, dare to dream, keep doing it, because those dreams fuel your art. And, just keep showing up. Keep showing up for your art in one way or another. And it doesn't have to be in a conventional way. It can be in a, I wear my bathrobe and my Scooby Doo slippers to Minion way, whatever it takes, So just keep doing it, and really it does help some, to be in a community, to have that structure, to get feedback from other writers, or even get feedback from people that you trust, readers that you trust. It doesn't have to even be in a class. So just keep engaging with it is really important.
I love that reminder also that there are so many twists and turns to arriving at a finished product. I think about I've never written a book, not yet at least. But I've done a lot of research, and there's always so many dead ends, and it can be hard to spend a lot of time researching something and then realizing it was a dead end. And I
Yes.
would always have to remind myself, like, that's part of the journey. Like, I had to explore that, even if it's not going to end up in this paper, even if it turns out to be irrelevant. Like, I had to go down that road to figure out which was actually the right place. And I think it can be so hard, especially in our culture, which is so kind of productivity oriented, not to feel like you've sort of wasted time if you've worked on something that ends up in the drawer, or if you start writing something in one way and then it has to be rewritten in another way. And I think it is such a beautiful reminder to think that all of it is art and all of it is contributing to just your own creativity and your own process, and the ultimate kind of flourishing of of your art and
Right.
your art
And
making.
there are many forms of productivity. Productivity takes on many different forms. Reading, reading is a great thing to do as a writer. I mean, it's very important. When I read a lot of poetry because it feeds my soul, and I love the language, and I love the lyricism, and I'm really inspired by a lot of poetry.
Well, and to go back to Henrietta Zold, who we were just talking about a moment ago, I think many people know Henrietta Zold as the founder of Hadassah. That's sort of what I would say she's best known for, although she did many, many other things that were quite astounding. But most people don't realize that she didn't actually move to Palestine until she was in her late 50s. And most of her life, was lived before that stage. She was working on Hadassah before that, but that was really the kind of the last stage of her life, was when she
Mhm.
was living there and building some of those institutions. And that, I think also, that there's that you're never too old to start something new and to begin a new adventure. And I think that's a really important reminder too, that we sometimes don't even know yet what the things are that we're going to be known for. And those things may happen, you know, far down the journey. And in some ways that brings me back a little bit also to your book, because part of what's interesting, I think, and mysterious about your dad is he lived a lot of life before he had his family.
It
Um,
did.
and that part of his life was kind of unknowable, but it was, he had this whole other life after he met your mom and had children. And that was a whole new phase for him.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love what you just said about Henrietta Zoll too. I wanna emphasize that, your second act can be as great or better than your first act. So, I want people to really hang on to that, and to believe that.
So tell us, just we have a couple minutes left, but tell us a little bit more about what you're working on now, what we can look forward to seeing from you, and what that process has been like for you, embarking on a new a new work after spending a long time working on this one.
Well, I have been writing essays about my mom. Some of them have been published already, and I think that I'm just going to collect all of the material, all of my scraps from the Notes app on my iPhone, every little bit that I've done, including the essays, and I'm going to see what I have, because I think she's really like making her way to the center stage here, and I think the next project belongs to her.
Mm, that's great, and we look forward to having you back at some point to talk about that story.
Thank you.
Um, and I think so often we find that the women's stories they're there, they're making themselves felt. They're not always center stage right away, but we part of what we do is, at JWA, is try to create space for people to bring those out. So we'll be very excited to hear about that too.
Well, I have a little JWA story. I'll tell you really briefly about my mother and me. We did the Aperture. We
Oh,
used
that's
the
great.
we
Story Aperture.
Yeah,
That's our story collecting app.
we did Story Aperture. And when she was still a little more clear a couple of years ago, we did.
And what was that like?
It was great because my mother and I have sort of arrived at a new era in our relationship, which we listen to each other a little bit more, which is nice. And she just talked about growing up in Cuba and going to the Jewish day school, the Zionist Jewish day school. It was called Theodore Herzl School, and she talked about the Sephardic community in Cuba and the Purim balls, and so it was great. It was really nice. I was really glad to have done it with her.
That's wonderful. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. I hope people will be inspired by that to use our app, which has question sets in it, and allows you to record a short interview and submit it to JWA, because that's how we build history, is by gathering all of the stories of daily life, big and small. And so that is a wonderful contribution. So
And and what you do is an inspiration to memoirists. It really is, because it's those kind of specific details and that kind of specificity that really builds worlds when you're writing memoir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you for being with us tonight, for sharing your story so honestly and so beautifully. It's really inspiring to hear about your process and about your success. And I want to thank everybody for joining our conversation tonight. It's always wonderful to have you all with us. And I keep saying this, but this has been such an important community that we've built over these many months, and it brings so much joy to me that people still want to gather. We still are getting hundreds of people every week coming to these conversations, and it's really wonderful to be able to come together in this way and share these conversations. Um, if you would like to learn more about Jewish women in Cuba, we have a new essay in our encyclopedia on that topic. And we also actually, during the launch of our encyclopedia in June, of our new edition of the encyclopedia, we did a session with Professor Ruth Behar on journeys of Cuban Jewish women. So if you want to explore a little more of that part of Judy's book, and of course you should read Judy's book, but if you want to learn a little more about that piece of her heritage, I encourage you to check those out. I hope you will also join us next week, same time, same place, for a discussion with Vanessa Zoltan about her book, Praying with Jane Eyre, Reflections on Reading as a Sacred Practice. And you can also check out our whole book list for the year, which we just announced on our site. Whet your appetite, give you a great reading list, and get you excited for some programs that are to come. Finally, please join us. We invite you to join us on Thursday, November 4th, to help us celebrate JWA's 25th anniversary. It's going to be a wonderful multi-generational event, including a couple celebrities there to help us celebrate. But really, we're going to be honoring our founders and our Rising Voices Fellowship community, our teen fellows. So our founders and our future. And you can find more information on our site at jwa.org/celebrate25. It is wonderful to be with all of you. And until next time, be well and have a lovely evening. Thank you all.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you everyone out there who attended. I'm really honored. Thank you.
Good night.